From beanies to carry bags and from shoes to caps, browse our shop now at tntradio.live. Informing, not boring. George Christensen on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Well, welcome back, my friend, to the George Christensen Show. We're here for the next few hours talking to some fantastic guests. But before I come on the air, actually, it was brought to my attention that something incredibly strange. You know those old jokes where you say, look under the dictionary definition of this and you'll see a picture of this person? Well, under the dictionary definition of anti-vaxxer, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, probably the most used in the United States of America, I now feature. Believe it or not, if you go to the online version of the Merriam-Webster dictionary and type in anti-vaxxer, they now have it set out so that, and this is bizarre, I've never seen this before with dictionaries, they now have it set out where it's almost like a Wikipedia page. They give you some definitions and they keep on giving you more and more definitions, and they talk about the usage. And it goes down to this: the term anti-vaxxer is sometimes applied to people who are not against the use of vaccines, but who do oppose policies, laws, etc. that require vaccination. People with such views often object to being characterised as anti-vaxxers. And the example they go to is yours truly. Saying I'm against coercion or mandates is not the same as telling people not to be vaccinated. I've had all of my vaccinations and took my daughter to the doctor the other day to get her vaccinations. I'm not an anti-vaxxer, it quotes George Christensen, quoted in Mackay, Daily Mercury Online, Australia. Unbelievable that I finally made the dictionary. But I tell you what, if you went to the dictionary definition of Crusader, you would probably see a photo of John Adams. He is indeed a public crusader who has spent many years dedicated to pursuing the public interest in Australia and driving real change. He's a professional economist by trade, a public policy practitioner. He was a former political advisor, and he spent decades building up his knowledge and expertise on economic and public policy analysis, as well as learning how government ticks. Now, starting in 2016, he took his deep concerns with the direction that the nation was headed into and started to voice those concerns through mainstream media and then eventually on his own platforms, particularly with YouTube. He's had a show on YouTube with a fellow commentator, Martin North, called In the Interests of the People. That has been highly successful. They've just finished that show, and now John is pursuing his own platform through the name the Public Crusader. Why has he done this? Because he's realised that through the power of social media and grassroots people power, that he can move from just being a commentator to becoming a change agent through well-targeted public initiatives. And that has worked for him in the past. I've known John for a long while. I worked with John on one campaign that I've got to say he spearheaded pretty much from the get-go, and that campaign was to stop the $10,000 cash transaction ban. The government of the day, which unfortunately was the former political party I was involved in, the Liberal National Party, the Liberal National government decided that they were going to enact laws which meant that if you made a purchase over $10,000, that it would be illegal if you did it in cash, which is legal tender. So in other words, they were creating a new form of legal tender, which would have been just bank transactions or credit card transactions. Quite bizarre that you would actually make legal tender something that can only benefit private companies, but there you go. But John led this grassroots coalition right across the nation that actually stopped that, and a lot of people in Parliament, including myself, got behind it to actually stop it. So welcome to you, John Adams. How's it going for you?
Thank you, George. Things are going well, and congratulations on getting into the dictionary.
Yeah, thanks very much, mate. Look, I've given a bit of an introduction of John Adams, but some people might not know you. Can you fill in any of the blanks that I might have left out?
In terms of your introduction, I think you've done it pretty well. So trained economist from Wollongong. I'm in Wollongong these days, just south of Sydney. And yeah, the thing is that it may be uncomfortable for you, George, given that you served in Parliament for a long time. But my basic thesis is that Australia has been in decline for at least 2 decades, and you can see it quite visibly in terms of just government statistics, whether it's about the economy, in terms of record debts, public sector debt, private sector debt, financial stress, educational outcomes are through the floor, public health, mental health, narcotics. Engineering standards. I mean, we can't even build a decent building in Sydney anymore because of shoddy work, and the place is just falling apart. And we have a cultural malaise, and obviously, I think you and I share concerns about the direction of Australian culture. I was born here. I'm 41. I've got 3 kids, and obviously. What really got me on this bandwagon, I have to say, George, was that when my first daughter was born in 2014, and you're obviously a father as well. They say that having children changes people a lot, particularly men. And the one thing I think happened to me was it just struck me that that I owe an obligation to my children to, I guess, make the best effort I can to make the country better, so when they become 18, that they can actually inherit something better than in terms of what I had. And the funny thing is that, having spoken to other parents, I mean, sometimes parents actually go into their shell and they think, well, I've got kids, I've got a mortgage, I don't want to rock the boat because I don't want to harm the children. I want to make sure the children are well provided and looked after. And I actually had the complete opposite psychological reaction. I said, no, look, if I don't act, I don't think I'm meeting my obligations as a father. And that's where, again, I started really on the commentary path, and then starting to do a bit of commentary on YouTube. I quickly learned that in the new environment, that using official processes of the law, the courts, the parliament, and then mobilizing people across the country in a sort of non-violent democratic way, you can actually drive change. But the one thing I will say is that doing it like the way I've done it is you can't tackle everything, and you have to be very focused, and you can only do a couple of things at a time. And that's where
that's right.
Sometimes people get frustrated because I talk about the one topic for quite a while. In the last 6 to 9 months, I've very focused on Asic, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. But if you want to get some decent outcomes, that's what it takes. And obviously with the cash ban, it took us 16 months in order to get the government to finally relent. And that was a slog, but that was important because, the one thing you, I guess, didn't fully highlight in your opening statement was that the Morrison government wanted to put people in jail for using legal tender. And even though there are, even though in Europe there is a cash transaction ban, the penalty is a civil fine, whereas Australia was the first country in the developed world proposing to put people in jail, which is just absolutely nuts.
It is absolutely nuts, but it's absolutely nuts from the get-go because, as you've just said, and as I said before, cash is legal tender. Tell me what else is considered legal tender? Nothing. So if you take away cash, you're left with nothing. You're left with no legal tender, or, as I said, you've created a new form of legal tender because you've pushed people away from what is actually legal tender, and you pushed them into the hands of private corporations. So this is, to me, it was a case of, and I completely agree with you here, John, a case of government doing something which was just inherently wrong to start with. You shouldn't be banning the transaction of cash, no matter how big the transactions are. But it was also government almost colluding with big business, these being the banks, to say, hey, we'll force people who do these large transactions to do it only through you so you can continue to skim stuff off the top. And to me, that's just that's incredibly wrong. But it seems to me to be part of the agenda that we're currently living through, where there's this World Economic Forum Great Reset, and they want governments and corporations to walk hand in hand. Decades and decades ago, they called that fascism, actually, but these days we're celebrating it. But anyway, I would agree with you that for the last couple of decades that the country has been on a downward spiral. I actually think that it's been probably for the better part of 5 decades. It's just that the last 2, it's been happening at a phenomenal rate. John, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what you have been focusing on, what I want to do is get beyond what you've done to get to what do you stand for. As a public crusader, what are your inherent beliefs about life, about the country, about the economy? What does John Adams believe in?
Well, the thing is that, one of the things that I probably don't like to pigeon myself whole in is to put myself into a particular political box. I mean, when I was 18, so I come from a Labor household. When I was a teenager, we were massive Keating supporters. Like in 1996, when Howard was elected, I lost my mind. I'm thinking, how could the country be so stupid? I was in high school and I was just completely naive about the whole political landscape. And when I was 18, I joined Labor. I was only in Labor for a short amount of time, and then I realised it wasn't for me. And then in my early 20s, going through university, I read a lot about the American Revolution, and then the whole notion of freedom really struck me, and then that led me into going into the Liberal Party, and I was in the Liberal Party for about 15 years, and that's when obviously I worked for Arthur Senator Dennis a decade ago, and you and I crossed paths in Parliament during that period of time, and then afterwards. But I quit the Liberal Party in 2016, and since 2016, I've been basically in the political wilderness, and I think for me,
was there a reason that you quit in 2016? What was the reason?
Well, look, so I think the Turnbull Prime Ministership really was pushing. He was pushing a number of policy. Well, no, look, actually, I shouldn't say that. He had no agenda. The reality of Turnbull was, when he was a teenager, and this is one of the things I picked up when I was working in Parliament. So when he was a teenager, he was walking all over Sydney Grammar School saying, I'm going to be Prime Minister one day. And so for him, there was the agenda of Turnbull was basically fulfilling a lifelong ambition, not that he actually wanted to do anything for the country. And that's why he was a complete, a political failure, because he basically stood for nothing. But no, there was a lot about there was 2 things. I would say the Turnbull leadership was one of the big catalysts, but obviously, and it's very interesting. You and I should have this discussion today. So the big news of today politically is that the New South Wales ICAC has done a number of police raids across the state into the Liberal Party, and have confiscated phones and laptops involving the former Premier's brother. So the level of corruption inside the New South Wales Liberal Party, and just the one of the shocking things, if we talk about the decline of Australia, George, is in political parties, particularly in New South Wales, there are things that people think are normal, which I look at and think that these are systemic corrupt practices. And one of the problems in New South Wales is that corrupt practices, which in a commercial setting would be the police would enforce the law. When it comes to when these tactics are being used in politics, the police are nowhere to be seen. And I've had a number of Liberal Party members say to me that the police won't touch this in a political context because of concerns of in terms of they don't want to upset people in the New South Wales Parliament. But again, factionalism and power for power's sake, and using any trick in the book to get power. That is just that is a corrosive political culture, and that's been happening in New South Wales for a very long time. And
on both sides, on the Labor side and the Liberal side, by the sounds of it too.
Oh, sure. And so obviously today it's now boiled over to the fact that the police and ICAC have now raided homes and confiscated property, and no doubt the there'll be some sort of public trial that will be coming up about a particular scheme to rig local council elections.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether or not that holds water. I know those allegations were aired in the New South Wales Parliament. It seems that the toppling of the New South Wales Liberal National Government has basically lifted the handbrake for the police to go and act. They've now acted. I mean, I'll let the courts or ICAC sort out that part of it. It does concern me, though, because I'm concerned about big government in itself. It concerns me the level of power, actually, the ICAC Strike Force police have. They can do basically whatever they want, and in some cases they do. Nonetheless, that matter will go to court, and we'll see what outcome there is. But from what I hear from what you've just outlined, John, your belief boils down to one key thing: freedom. Freedom for the individual. Is that pretty much the summary of John Adams' belief system?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, look, I would add a few more things to that, but freedom is a core concept, and one of the reasons why freedom is core to, I guess, my worldview is that I think it's inherent in human nature that we want to be free and we want to live life along in terms of our own terms, but also purely from an economic point of view. I mean, we have the experience of history, and we know that free markets, they do work better in terms of generating economic outcomes. And again, there are some negative drawbacks from free markets, in economic speak, it's called externalities. And there is a role to ensure that those perverse outcomes do not get achieved. But even in terms of economics, the best way to have a prosperous society is to give people as much freedom to build businesses and to build goods and services at prices people want to pay, and for people to operate in the free market.
Sounds good to me. Let freedom ring here on the George Christensen Show. You're listening to John Adams on TNT Radio.
TNT Radio's Jesse Zerowell.
Late last week, 34 rockets were fired from Lebanese territory towards Israel, 25 of which were intercepted by the air defense systems. 5 other projectiles landed on Israeli soil. After this, the Zionist entity's military forces took to bombing Lebanon and Gaza. And in all the media coverage of this I've encountered, it's been referred to as a cycle of violence, predictably, and little, if any, context has been given, particularly with regard to what's been happening in occupied Al-Quds or Jerusalem, what's been happening at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam, where Ramadan is being observed, and Zionist goon squads have been entering and viciously beating worshippers.
Jesse Zerowell on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Affordable housing, we can build that. Sustainable housing, we can build that. At MIT Modular, we understand the importance of housing for all and the importance of design, cost, and functionality. Our goal is to meet the needs of our growing population by converting shipping containers to livable units. If you're like-minded and in a position to invest in something meaningful and life-changing, we want to hear from you. We are a team of professional architects, engineers, and financial and tax experts dedicated to offering unique solutions that provide a brighter future. Our Opportunity Zone Fund offers investors both real estate and operating business diversification, 5-year tax deferral on capital gains, annual tax benefits, and ultimately tax-free appreciation potential. There are opportunity zones all over America. If you're interested in learning more about our services, need affordable housing, or want to participate in creating a new vision for tomorrow, give us a call in the U.S. on 385-985-5702. Or read more at mitmodular.com. MIT Modular. We can build that.
George Christensen on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
You're back with George Christensen here on TNT Radio's The George Christensen Show. I'm joined by economist John Adams, who is now firmly considering himself, and he is, a public crusader. If you go to the website publiccrusader.com that John Adams has set up, you can see all of the work that he has done and is continuing to do. But I want to turn now to the meat of this discussion, John, and that is your current crusade, which has been going for quite a while now. You tantalizingly teased us with the talk of, I think it was the quest and then the package for quite some time. The quest, as I understood it, was a private investigation that you undertook into what you saw was corruption within the corporate world. We can't say too much here about the detail of that because it is still very much something that's under investigation. The package was the culmination of that investigation that you brought before Asic, and Asic, renowned for being this toothless tiger that doesn't pick up anything and run with it, actually picked up your package, looked at the elements of the quest and said there's something to see here. So they're currently investigating it. But investigating is a very, very slow thing when it comes to Asic. And all of this has culminated itself into a parliamentary inquiry that you've had established into Asic's investigation and enforcement performance. Unbelievable stuff that has all been initiated by John Adams. But let's go back to the very beginning, and I want to, avoid the minefield of defamation here, John. But without naming names and pointing to specifics, can you just talk us through the quest, the package, the Asic investigation, and the parliamentary inquiry, beginning with the quest? What was the quest?
Sure. So what happened was that in the first half of 2021, two people approached me and they told me about a huge grand conspiracy within corporate Australia in terms of something that is happening that was ripping a lot of money out of innocent people's wallets, and a lot of people had no idea that this was happening. So when it was first put to me that this was happening, and obviously it's this particular type of scheme in mind, I initially said it cannot be what's being proposed or what's being told to me. I said it can't be real because it's we're talking significantly large numbers. We're talking significantly large number of potential victims, and it was put to me that this has been happening for at least 1 to 2 decades, completely undetected. No one had any idea about it, but it was happening in broad daylight. And I think to myself, what's the chances of that happening in this country? And I'm interested in your perspective, George, given you were a parliamentarian. No doubt you would have had representations from constituents quite often about certain concerns happening in Australia. And sometimes you get told of real things and small things, and sometimes you get told of big things that seem fanciful. So what happened to me was initially I said, well, it can't be real. And then the more I thought about it, I thought to myself, well, I want to find out if this is real or not. So what ended up happening was, and obviously, as you said in your intro, I'm an economist. I'm not a lawyer, not a private investigator. I have no law enforcement experience. So I thought to myself, well, let me start to piece together the evidence that I can compile and obviously work my way through that. So, it took me a few weeks to get the first folder of evidence together. Then I went to a lawyer and I said, okay, so you're going to read something and I'm going to pay you some money and I want you to tell me what you think. So we got some initial legal advice, and the advice was there could be something here, go to Asic. So then I thought to myself, well, I don't think I have enough. in terms of going to ASIC. So let me keep on digging, and but also not just digging. Let me learn about what I'm dealing with here, because one thing I've noticed, particularly around government and public policy, is the more you learn about the process, the better chance you have of getting an outcome out of the process. So learning about ASIC, but also concluding the investigation, it took 9 months and $50,000 self-finance of my own money, and that money went to lawyers and barristers and accountants and consultants and auditors, etc.
That 50 grand wasn't just your time costs. That was actual real incurred costs. Your time in undertaking this investigation was on top of that 50,000. Am I right?
Correct. Yeah. So 50,000 hard money to pay for various expenses, and then for me, I really didn't work for 9 months. And I initially thought this was going to take, a month or 2 months, but the more you get into something, it just became an obsession. And so I thought to myself, well, no, we're going to, and here's the thing, George, once you commit yourself halfway, you can't stop. You've got to keep going. But also the high risk of this sort of activity is, as you keep on digging, at any point in time, you could get a piece of evidence which completely debunks the case theory. But as I kept on digging and using different techniques of investigation, it all started to line up to say that there's something to this grand conspiracy that got told in 2021. So short story is, in April of last year, I went to ASIC with a 608-page file of evidence.
This is what you. This is the package. This is, and where I get these terms from, dear friend, dear listener, is John has been prolific on social media, whether it's Facebook or Telegram, but more so YouTube. And these terms, the quest, as I said, he teased us with the quest that he was undertaking, and then he teased us with the package. But I saw the package in a video you did with Martin there. In the interests of the people, and it was a mammoth document. How many pages did you say?
Yeah, so it was 608 pages. And what that comprises of, George, it's a 3-page cover letter signed by my barrister, a 53-page complaint that my barrister and I signed, and 103 exhibits of evidence. So what we basically said to ASIC is, we're going to tell you a case theory. We're going to tell you that 15 laws across the Commonwealth and state have been contravened, and these are the facts that we outline, and each of the facts are supported by a particular exhibit. And so that's how we basically were able to step through our case. And we said to ASIC, we want you to investigate. Now, here's the interesting thing. Near the end of the investigative process, as I was continuing to learn about ASIC, I started to say, well, let me read the annual report. And then when I looked at their own statistics, I realized at the end of the investigation, the chances of getting an investigation was less than 1%. So I thought to myself, hang on, I've just spent 50 grand and 9 months, and now I've learned at the end of the process, the chances of actually pulling this off and actually getting an official criminal investigation is less than 1%. I thought to myself, maybe I should have found...
That just means you've given them a brief, and for some people that might be a 1-page letter. For you, it was a 600-plus page thorough analysis. You almost handed them an investigation wrapped up already. But what you're saying is that of all of the complaints that end up going to the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, the body that is tasked in this country with looking at corporate crime, less than 1% of all of those complaints end up being investigated. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Yes. And so the 3 main sources in which ASIC gets reports of alleged misconduct, there's liquidators who have a statutory obligation to provide reports to ASIC. There's the public. And then you have auditors, but you also have holders of financial services licenses that they're obligated to provide what they call breach reports. When they break the law, they have to basically fess up and tell the regulator they've broken the law. So when you put all that together, how many investigations have been happening? Less than 1%. And one of the concerning elements that I learnt as I was going through ASIC's own data was that since 2015, the number of investigations has gone through the floor. whistleblower rejection rates is at 91%. Reports of alleged misconduct that resulted in no further action has gone through the roof over the last 11 years, and all the trends is saying that this is a failing agency. And the one thing I've learned in the last 9 months, George, is behind these rejection statistics is a real story of someone saying there's something wrong, I've lost money, I've been ripped off, or there's been a corporate criminal, and nothing's been done. So the fact that I was able to get an investigation was remarkable in and of itself. But obviously, when I went through the process, and here's the thing, George, I think I'm a relatively capable individual, but this was the hardest thing I personally have ever had to do. And the fact that when I got to the finish line, I just thought to myself, the mum and dad retail investor, whether in Queensland where you are or where I am in New South Wales, has no chance to put the time, the money, the team together and to get the evidence. Because to get the evidence is, this is the thing I've appreciated in the last 2 years. To actually get evidence that incriminates someone, it is remarkably hard in order to get enough evidence to actually prove that someone is doing something wrong. And particularly as a civilian, the police and Asic have extraordinary powers where they can force people to hand over documents or devices. And we just talked about ICAC raiding people's houses to get phones and laptops. But when you're a private civilian and you don't have those powers, but you need enough evidence to get Asic to do its job, it is near impossible. And so that's why I thought to myself, well, even though I've been successful and I don't have sour grapes, there needs to be something that Parliament needs to look into, because I know that the mum and dad investor at home can't do what I did. And that's where, after I submitted my package in April of last year, I then went to work on writing a public report about Asic, which culminated in me publishing 2 reports in October last year calling for a public inquiry. And of all the people that came to the table to say, well, let's have an inquiry, was Senator Andrew Bragg, Liberal from New South Wales, and we got an inquiry. And not only did we get one, we got 2. Labor voted against the coalition's inquiry and set up their own. And here we are in 2023. The Labor inquiry, funny enough, nothing has happened with that one, and looks like it was a complete political stunt. Whereas the Bragg inquiry has been running, and they spent 4 months collecting submissions, and the submissions process of accepting submissions has been relatively slow over the last 6 weeks. But that process is ongoing, and then we'll no doubt get into some public hearings.
Yeah. Now, look, I have to say, Andrew Bragg, he's one of the World Economic Forum alumni, so not my favoured sort of senator, but how has he been in terms of you and the evidence that you have put before the committee? How has the whole committee been with the evidence that you've put before them?
Well, the thing is that here's the thing. When I did the rounds in August last year, so well before I published the report, I had a series of graphs, and I went around and spoke to a number of people in Parliament, and I said there's a big problem with Asic because I've gone through this process, and it's and the performance is getting worse. And we've had the Royal Commission that you were obviously instrumental in getting up. We've had inquiries, reviews, and they're just getting bad. And I've gone through it firsthand, and I can see how there's all sorts of problems in terms of how they perform. And so this is one of the issues, George, where it didn't matter who I spoke to, particularly in the Senate. And there was universal concern back in August, and so I knew that the environment was ripe for something to happen in the Senate, and that's why when I put out the report, So it just so happened Senator Bragg called me one morning as I was driving to Canberra and said the vote's on tomorrow. I think this was on the Wednesday, the day after the budget. The Chalmers handed out. He calls me at 8 o'clock in the morning as I'm driving to Canberra. Goes, the vote's tomorrow. So get ready. So we were stunned by that, but then we got the inquiry up. And the one thing I will say is slightly disappointing is that the inquiry secretariat has said that they've received hundreds of submissions to date. And so there's a lot of material to process, and some of it is quite complex. But the speed in which the process of submissions that have happened, it hasn't met, I think, what the stakeholders expect, but also I think the seriousness of how problematic this whole area is. I think the senators really need to get focused and actually get the skates on, because it's been dragging out a little bit too long for people's liking.
It's almost becoming an Asic investigation by the sounds of it, how slow it is. So all of the submissions have been put in. Submissions are over for this inquiry, I gather. It is now in the deliberation stage. Like, have you got any intel on where it's at?
Well, so 46 submissions have been processed, and they've been published on the inquiry webpage. But we've been told there's hundreds of submissions. So there's still at least maybe 200 submissions yet to be officially processed, and we're waiting to see. Well, I mean, we've had some assurances that by the end of April that process will conclude, and then there'll be some announcements around hearings. So we'll just have to wait and see when that actually comes about. But fingers crossed that the inquiry can get back on track, and we can actually hold Asic to account, because one of the things I've said publicly in some of my recordings is that these are cockroaches. I mean, they survive everything. They've survived the Royal Commission, they've survived the reviews, they've survived inquiries, and they've got a number of long-term staff at the top level that the Parliament can't. Not only the Parliament, but also the government of the day can't seem to get rid of, and they just keep on hanging around. And it's like, well, I think the leadership of Asic is needs a complete overhaul. And obviously, if I get to testify at the inquiry, I'll be calling for wholesale change of leadership, so that we can actually have proper people that actually can foster the right type of culture that can actually get the outcomes that the Australian public what they expect from the corporate regulator.
Well, here's hoping you do get in front of that parliamentary inquiry, John Adams. Back after the break here on the George Christensen Show here on TNT Radio.
With his expert analysis and opinion, this is TNT Radio's Timothy Shea.
People gleeful that Budweiser and Bud Light sales are off 80% since corporate giant AB InBev decided to do a promotion with transvestite influencer Dylan Mulvaney are missing the point. Corporations no longer care about their customers. That's not their business model anymore. Their business model now is to maximize their ESG score, environmental, social, and governance. And part of ESG is DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And part of DEI, that would be the company's corporate equality index put out by the Human Rights Campaign, an LGBT WTF green mail operation. Corporate America couldn't care less about its customers any longer. All it cares about is keeping the professional grievance industry and its alphabet soup of idiotic hate indices appeased so that they don't end up on the wrong side of a social media hate campaign. From MAGAInstitute.com, this is Timothy Shea for TNT Radio.
Chris Domine is a husband, father, an athlete, even an Ironman. But 10 years ago, Chris's kidneys were failing.
The doctor said, if you don't get a kidney transplant, you are going to die.
Chris received a second chance, made possible by an organ donor.
Your well-being changes from loss of hope to better times ahead.
What could you make possible as an organ, eye, and tissue donor? Leave behind the gift of life. Go to organdonor.gov. U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Health Resources and Services Administration.
George Christensen on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Well, we're back on the George Christensen Show. I'm joined by economist and public crusader John Adams here on TNT Radio. And John has just laid out what I called the meat. It was a quest, or the quest as he called it. He undertook a private investigation into allegations of corporate corruption. He actually did that. It cost him tens of thousands of dollars. He put together documentation from that investigation, 600 plus page report, including a lot of different evidence, put that to Asic. That's what he called the package. Asic is still currently investigating this matter. Is that correct, John? It's still under investigation?
I have 3 emails from Asic over the last 10 months saying that the investigation is officially ongoing.
Well, there you go. So it's taken a hell of a long time now. What date was it that you actually presented that 600-plus page report to them?
April 6th of last year, so it's over a year ago, but we didn't get an official confirmation that the investigation had commenced until July of last year.
Okay, well, it's been over a year since the documents have been with ASIC and no action as yet. Now, we're not going to detail the allegations that John put through, except to say this was a major player in corporate Australia. It was, as John has said, a grand conspiracy, and more to the fact, it was ostensibly market manipulation that was going on, whereby a lot of mum and dad investors in this particular product could potentially have been hurt and gypped, or maybe hurt in the future. But John, there's a political element to this, a very big political element, because again, without detailing the company and without giving away too much in terms of when this actually occurred, but the Prime Minister, who was then the leader of the opposition, actually did a visit, a campaign sort of style visit to this particular business that was under investigation by ASIC, and he did a doorstop press conference there at this business. Isn't that right?
Well, so what I would say, George, is a couple of things. Is that the Prime Minister, before the May 22 election, was seen with the company, made a number of representations, made a number of public statements about the company, et cetera, and
glowingly favourable, no doubt.
Yes, absolutely. So all that happened before the federal election. Now, the one thing I'll say is that in July of last year, when I met the ASIC investigators, I put on the record the concerns not only of me but other participants in my investigation that Albanese may have some sort of ability to influence what ASIC may do, given that there is a long-standing relationship. Now, at that meeting, I remember quite clearly the senior investigator said, "Well, we're an independent commission. Albanese would be stupid to do anything that would interfere in what we do, because we're law enforcement and we do what we do." So that was the assurances that I was given in July. But obviously, I wanted to put on the record that there was no ambiguity about the Prime Minister's long-standing sort of relationship. But what happened during the last 10 months was the Prime Minister, as Prime Minister. So again, what I just documented for you, George, was when he was leader of the opposition. But as Prime Minister, as head of the government, he was again seen with the company, made a number of positive statements, and this is where I put in a confidential submission to the inquiry back in January, which has now been accepted. And this is what I have done a provocative video with Martin Law called The Final Secret, exposing the Australian Prime Minister. And what we say is the following: this is perhaps one of the most unparalleled circumstances in Australian history, that you have a criminal investigation by the corporate regulator at the same time that the Prime Minister, the head of the government, has been endorsing the company that I've made serious allegations against, and these allegations are serious enough that ASIC says, given that they hardly investigate anything at all, they said that on this occasion, no, we have to investigate because the allegations are so serious. But not only that, George, is that I'd say two other points is, even though it's almost impossible to get an investigation up, once the investigation starts, within the course of a few months, ASIC can sniff out as to whether there's anything to the allegations or not. And so the fact that we've been going for 10 months, I mean, that would signify that ASIC has had the ability to close the investigation and conclude it, but they haven't done so. So that's point one. The second point I will say is that, and this is one of the points that I've made to the inquiry, is that there's another case study called Mayfair 101, which has been a catastrophe which investors have lost $211 million. And that catastrophe was instigated by ASIC because ASIC was concerned that Mayfair 101 was engaged in untoward activity, and they were under investigation. So what happened in this Mayfair case was they were under investigation on the 29th of January 2020, and within 7 weeks, ASIC rushed to court on a charge of misleading deceptive conduct. And the ASIC said in a public statement that the reason why they rushed to court was because they were concerned about new investors being drawn into those products that they had concerns about. So now I've made here's the thing. So one of the allegations I've made is the charge of misleading deceptive conduct. And my concern is that ASIC, when ASIC wants to move at lightning speed, we have other case studies where they've moved within 7 to 8 weeks from start of investigation to court. And here we are after 10 months. And I've reviewed the evidence in the Mayfair case, and I've looked at it against my evidence. And I think the evidence in my case is 10 times stronger. And yet ASIC and the government has allowed the public to continue to operate completely in the dark. And so this is the big concern I have, is because the only difference I see between my situation, Mayfair, is you've got a prime minister who's putting his nose in the middle. And so that's why I've raised it with the parliament. And the one thing I will say is that, which has been quite concerning, is that the lack of interest from the parliament about this potential conflict of interest with the PM, but also from the mainstream media. I mean, you would have thought that that with this sort of detail, there'd be a lot more phone calls, there'd be a lot more interest to say, well, what's really going on here? But it's been crickets from the people who are basically charged within our political system to hold the government to account. And obviously, now the one thing I will say is that my confidential submission has been accepted by the inquiry. The inquiry has actually asked me to hand over the package, and I've handed parts of the package over, and now I'm waiting for the inquiry to make their next step. But again, so in terms of where we go from here, it's either going to be that ASIC concludes the investigation, says John Adams was crazy and there was nothing to it, or if they say no, John Adams was right, even though that justice at the end of the day may be done, I think the fact that they've taken too long to bring the matters to a head, I think that's going to be I think that's going to be ASIC's downfall, because I'll have plenty to say that ASIC had the opportunity to save the Australian people, at a much earlier point in time, and I'll have to explain why they didn't and whether the government's involvement in this matter had anything to do with it.
Yeah, look, of course, the allegations that you've made against this company, and I'm not being disparaging or negative, because I'm privy to some of the information, and I think that there is definitely smoke here, and where there's smoke, there's fire. But they are, at this stage, still allegations. But the company in question, again, I don't want to let too much out of the bag, so I don't want to fall afoul of defamation law. But it's not the first run-in they've had with government regulators, actually. They've been pinged before by a federal agency, and we'll just leave it at that. But that is a fact, haven't they, John? They've been pinged by another federal agency for their misadventures before, correct?
Yes. They have been, and that particular government agency, I had an opportunity to go to speak with them in the last 6 to 9 months, and So I pretty much said to these people, you've been looking at these people from one perspective. There's another perspective to look at, and we spent a couple of hours going through the package and explaining what's going on, and since then, we've let that agency, continue its course of business, and we'll obviously see if we hear any news in terms of 2023. But I know, George, that you haven't been a parliamentarian, that the wheels of government can move slowly, but particularly when the citizens are in harm, whether it's financial or of a physical nature, you think that government can actually move at lightning speed. But why have they been going at a snail's pace given the circumstances? I think maybe you're in a better position to advise me than for me to conclude anything concrete.
Well, mate, I wish that I could answer that question. I obviously was one who became incredibly frustrated by those slow wheels of government. It almost just is accepted as a given these days that, it takes them 4 weeks to actually get a letter response back. That's the kind of expectations that we have around the Canberra bureaucracy, sadly. But look, I just want to go back to the political connection here with this company at the centre of your quest, your package, and the Asic investigation, and the fact that the Prime Minister had some link with it. At least he had a link in go to this business as part of a sort of a media event where he did a press conference where he touted the business and sang their praises. You've taken this information, right, as you alluded to many people in Parliament, including members of the opposition. And, if I was a member of the opposition and I had this information and I knew what the company was under investigation for, if I knew what the other government agency had already found out about this company and I knew what the Prime Minister had said about the company, I would be so inclined to go and give a speech to the Parliament under the coverage of privilege where I would outline all of that because it is in the public interest to know. But you basically heard crickets from the opposition. Is that right?
Yes. The thing is, look, there has been a number of backbenchers both in the House and the Senate where there's been crickets. But also, look, the one thing I can reveal in this conversation is that at the beginning of February, I did have a meeting with Dutton's office, and we went through
Peter Dutton, yes.
quite a bit of material for an hour. And one of the interesting things I have to say, George, I think the legacy of Godwin Gretsch has had a huge impact in terms of politicians having the confidence of actually saying things on the record. Because obviously, the one thing I'll give Turnbull is that in that instance, he wanted to bring down the Prime Minister himself. And so he calls the press conference and says, Rudd and Swan have to go. They've acted improperly. And unfortunately, the evidence that he thought he had was concocted by Gretsch. And so obviously one of the things I've been saying to all the parliamentary stakeholders I've been dealing with is I'm not Godwin Gretsch. There is, a real investigation by Asic. There is documentation to that effect. We have documented things about the PM, etc. And again, so but I have to say, you've got Peter Dutton focused on The Voice, and he's focused on a whole host of other things. I'm thinking to myself, giving you something that could be, that could change the course.
Well, we might have just lost you there, John. You've just dropped out.
So far,
no, you're back. Sorry, you just dropped out for a moment there, mate.
Sure. I was just going to say, Dutton's office has been, quite disappointing. But the one thing I'll also say, George, which is, I'm interested in your view, is that walking around the opposition now, and obviously it's fresh from a big loss in terms of last year. But what I sense is they've lost the will to win. The killer instinct that you need in politics to actually take the political fight to the public and to the parliament. The opposition is weak, it's limp, and I look. Maybe they're confused as to where they go from here after losing government. But yeah, look. A decade ago, you had a number of enforcers. You had Cormann, Brandis, Abetz, Abbott. You had a number of people who had, putting their policy views aside, they had strong personalities and they had the confidence to attack. In a political context, and you look at the current opposition, and those types of strong personalities are completely absent, and that's, I think, a very big concern because and to be honest, obviously in terms of the cash ban, but also in terms of some other initiatives that I was against the Morrison government on and the Turnbull government, I worked with Labor, so I'm a big proponent that for Parliament to work effectively, irrespective of who's the government, you need a strong opposition, and a strong opposition needs to have the confidence to attack the government.
That's right. No, you hit the nail on the head, mate. I probably can't add anything to your assessment of the opposition. We do need a strong opposition to make sure that the government's held to account. But in the absence of that, we've now got John Adams as well, the Public Crusader. Go and check more on John Adams at publiccrusader.com. You've been listening to George Christensen here on The George Christensen Show, TNT Radio. We'll be back after the news headlines.